a few people still out there, I think, arranging flowers. I'm going to go ahead and get started so that we can get done by 12:30. Shouldn't take too long this morning. Initially, my plan was to have this be our first week looking at Richard Hooker's book 5 in his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity on public worship. And the little book that I will be, hopefully will be here next week, is called A House for the Word, which is a modern translation of Richard Hooker. So my plan was that they'd be here already. I have been asking for weeks from Davenant and I've been waiting on emails back and forth from Davenant to finally get it through. And I actually ordered, I thought, you know what, it's too late. I'm just going to order them from Amazon. And I went and ordered the books from Amazon the beginning of this week. And at the last minute, they get back to me and say, "Oh, we've got a huge discount for you." So I was like, "All right," canceled the orders from Amazon. I'll wait for the Davenant ones to come in. I also have, if you're here next week, I have something for all of you as every family that is. Their Davenant publish. This is the second year in a row they've done it, but they have published a book called Advent Homilies. Last year they published one by Augustine called Advent Homilies. They did it again this year with John Newton. So if you're here next week, and if you're not here next week, just come see me later, because I got everybody a copy of Newton's Advent Homilies. So that's your Christmas gift. So come and see me if you're not here next week. But I wanted to get them to you at the first week of Advent. Like I said, between emails going back and forth, trying to finalize the order, and then somebody was sick and somebody was away, and finally didn't get them ordered until this week. But they should be here next week. So in light of that, what I did this week is try to put something else together as a kind of bridge into what we'll begin talking about next week as we read Richard Hooker. So I want to, I guess, contribute to the mess a little more. Josh has, in the past several weeks, been kind of setting the stage by showing us the issues, and raising questions, not necessarily, giving us landing spaces on them yet. And I want to kind of just add to that a little bit more to try to frame the issue of Anglicanism in the world today. Like, where do we fit in the world today? So, a couple of points just to start off. When we go back to there's a kind of inherent contradiction, let's put it that way, in Anglicanism. If you go back to the Reformation, prior to the Reformation, you have the Roman Catholic Church, right? Which is the one universal church. And the Reformation can be seen as a kind of nationalist or political reaction to the globalist and universalist tendencies of Rome. Okay? So whether it is Martin Luther in the German states, who is kind of railing against, in addition to his theological points, is kind of politically railing against the corruption in the Mediterranean, in the Italian peninsula, against Rome. All the rich elites down there are taxing us as part of the Holy Roman Empire, and that's where all the money is, that's where all the wealth is, that's where all the power is. They've kind of left behind the Germans. So you have a kind of nationalist rhetoric in Martin Luther a lot of times, as he is, in addition to the theological points that he's making, as he is trying to talk about theology for Germany, the church for Germany. Of course, that even becomes even more explicit in the English Reformation, right? Because there you've got a king out and out saying we are a separate jurisdiction from Rome. And England has an archbishop, actually two, one in Canterbury, one in York, and I, as king, am the head of the church here in England. And so you've got this nationalist reaction. So fast forward from that, And as the church in England grows and it launches the largest missionary movement in the history of the church, it goes into Africa, it goes into Asia, and North America, South America. What you get is a kind of universalizing tendency, right? So the Anglican church, and we still see that today in the global Anglican communion. So, how do you justify yourself as a church that started out as a kind of nationalist reaction against Rome, saying we need the Bible in our vernacular, we need the services in the prayer book in our vernacular, and we need an English church for the English people? And then become an empire, and now you've got a church in South Africa, in Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, and in China and Japan, and in Malaysia, and in Canada, and in America, and in, I could go on and on, the Caribbean. So if the Church of England started out as a Church of England for the English, then to what degree can you maintain your standards across a global communion? So if it's a church for the English people, how do you expect Kenyans or Ugandans or Nigerians or Japanese to worship in the exact same way, right? Without universalizing, kind of like the Roman Catholic Church, right? So you see that inherent contradiction between having a church for the English and a church by the English that is global, okay? So what degree, what that brings up is a couple of questions. One, what does it mean to worship in the vernacular? And this is a question very relevant and becoming ever more so today. What does it mean to worship in the vernacular? When we hear word vernacular, we just think English language, right? Our language. But think about everything else that comes along with just basic language. We could broaden that category out. For example, in our prayer book, since we have a combination of the 1662 and 1928 prayer books, we retain in this book, there's prayers for the king and the queen, right? For Parliament. And we skip over those prayers in morning prayer and we just pray for the president, right? But if you were going to get the original American prayer book of 1789, those prayers wouldn't be in there. They didn't have prayers for the king. They dropped all that out. Is not that part of the vernacular? You see how the vernacular goes beyond just the English language, but actually speaks to the particularities of a particular country and their unique historical situation. So, now if we can understand and say, well, it makes sense to, we're in America, we don't have a king, we don't have a parliament, we don't have a queen, let's get rid of those prayers. And we can come up against other parts in our prayer book and say, oh, I guess we didn't really need that anymore. This only applied back, in the English context. We don't live in that context. We can think of a couple of other examples. But then how far do you continue to go in order to get the language into the vernacular? So we would agree that the Queen's English that we see in our prayer book is a little antiquated compared to how we normally speak, right? This is why in our bulletin I've updated pretty much all of it so that we're using yous and yours instead of these and thous, right? So, what's that? Oh, okay. I didn't look that way. So, that's another kind of vernacular, right? They're both English, right? But what if we modernized it even more to make it even more relevant? We just change it because people talk today. Gen Z has kind of language, right? That we could, but think about what that actually means, how broad you can take vernacular. okay? And across different countries and cultures. We're just talking about English within one tradition. Where is the line between making a prayer book or even the Bible, making it understandable for a culture or a different country, and losing the essence of what makes Anglican, right? So there is a lot, more and more, that's falling under this term vernacular, right? In terms of changes and updates and revisions to prayer books. There are a ton of prayer books out there, by the way. If you think there's just, there have been so many prayer books, it is ridiculous. Just in the English. Now they've got prayer books all across the world in all of these countries, and they've got competing prayer books sometimes. So where is the line between where it's harder than you think to distinctly draw a line between worship in the vernacular and actually messing with some theological assumptions, right? How do we do that? Where do we draw that line? What is it that keeps us together as Anglicans, but not wanting to universalize? We want the faith to be inculcated into different types of languages and peoples. We want them to really get it, in other words. We want it to become enculturated, right? Where they embrace it. And it's part of who they are too, not just an English imposition. But how do we do that and at the same time not lose what is the essence of Anglican worship? So, I'll give you a couple of examples in terms of, to continue to go down this road of the vernacular. South Africa. So in South Africa, their prayer book for communion, and I don't have a copy with me right now, but the South African prayer book has a major emphasis in their communion service on reconciliation and peace. Any idea why that would be? Right? Yeah, so some of our language, I'm not talking about they use just slightly different words, but you can write, they have whole sections that are devoted to, that you would get the impression that the Eucharist is all about reconciliation and peace. That's what it's all about. We come and we partake in communion and we go from here and live in peace. We don't have that, right? But they're dealing with the fallout from apartheid, right? So it's even questionable, I would say. The theology is even questionable. They go so far in emphasizing mission, peace, reconciliation, that I think it loses something in terms of God, our relationship to God, the more vertical relationship, because it's so big on the horizontal, right? Churches in other countries like India or Pakistan or the United Arab Emirates, that there they have an Anglican church that is a collection of Anglicans and non-Anglicans, basically just all Protestants. So I remember when Obed was still here, and he had served both in the Church of Pakistan and in the Church of the United Arab Emirates, the Anglican Church in the United Arab Emirates. And he said in the UAE, there were only 3 churches allowed: Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Anglican. You pick one. So if you're a Protestant, you go to the Anglican church. It's for everybody. Pakistan, it was a similar sort of thing. Like the Christians there, you can't, when you're under persecution, you can't, split all the theological hairs you would like to maintain your purity. You come together with Christians, and you had Roman Catholics, and you had in Pakistan a combination of the Scottish Presbyterians and the Anglicans basically came together, and it's under an Anglican bishop. But what do you do in places like that where you have Anglicans who are liturgical and non-Anglicans out of necessity having to come in who aren't liturgical, who don't have that tradition? Well, what you end up getting is prayer books that are very stripped down, very minimalistic in terms of liturgy at all. And take communion as an example. You'll find the communion services very much minimized in terms of their prayers. We pray 3 different prayers right before we sing the Agnus Dei, right? They have it stripped down because some of the theology in our prayers is controversial to non-liturgical Protestants. Okay, so they have a prayer book very much minimized that includes questionably essential elements to a communion service, right? So what I'm stressing here is, how do you maintain a kind of center? How do you maintain an identity, an Anglican identity, with prayer books and worship in other countries that you want to be particularized to that country, but you've got a broad range of what the vernacular means, and it's really hard to maintain unity that way, right? So there's a tension between really connecting with people in the quote-unquote vernacular and maintaining a common identity. Well, and we could also say this. This is I just want to touch on this before I go on because I'll get too far away. I wanted to raise the question, what right does a state have to govern the church? So the Church of England obviously was a state church. Started out as such. I didn't, obviously, you know the story, I've said it many times. I wouldn't say that it started out as, but in terms of the Reformation, it was a state church and breaking away from the church in Rome. And does that have any abiding legitimacy? I think if we asked what right does the state have to interfere with the church, I think a lot of us instinctively would say, keep the state out of the church, right? It has no right. It's the state. But in terms of unity, if we're not going to have the Roman church, we're not going to have a universal church apart from the state, and we're not going to have the state involved in the church, basically, we are headed straight towards some version of congregationalism, right? So inevitably, we're not going to find unity based on geography, based on nationhood, and we're not going to find it because we don't say that there's one institutional church. Eventually, I mean, you might have degradations until you get to complete congregationalism, but the logical argument is, if you're going to base unity just on your local congregation, right, who's in and who's out, you're basically arguing with a congregationalist assumption. And to be honest, I would say the ACNA is not much more than dressed up congregationalism for the most part. That might sound like a bold thing to say, but in the end, well, I mean, that's really kind of what it is, because it's instead of an archbishop in the ACNA having much power at all, he's kind of a figurehead. You kick it down to the dioceses, and then even within the dioceses, you have subgroups that practice a certain way and groups that push another way, right? And so there isn't a whole lot of uniformity in the ACNA. That's why you got such a wide range, right? So if we say, and this will be something we come up against when we read Hooker in the coming weeks, in terms of the church being a public entity, right? Not just a private club, and public worship. Does the state have anything to... I understand I don't want our state having anything to do with the church at this point. That's not what I'm arguing. But what I'm saying as a theoretical matter, is it theoretically down to the core true that absolutely, fundamentally, the state should have no role, right? Well, that's what they said back before the Reformation, and that's why you had the bishop was seen as head over all of the heads of state. I'm sorry, what did I just say? The bishop? The pope was seen over all heads of state, right? And the state was separate. So when states started getting involved, the Lutheran state did with the Schmalkaldic League, fighting back against Charles V, the emperor, and of course Henry VIII did in England, and of course you have the break-off group like the cantons in Switzerland doing the same thing. You have some kind of public force to protect the church from the international Catholic Church that's trying to dominate it, right? And without that, if you have neither of those things, you end up going in the Anabaptist direction, and you end up with Congregationalism. Which is why also when you have New England, the Puritans in New England, they come out of the Church of England, and they're very anti-Rome. They're not going to go in that direction. Which direction do they immediately go? The church in New England, among all the Puritans, they were all Congregationalists. So anyway, that's something to throw out there too, and that'll come up again as we read Hooker. All right, so I've raised these questions about uniformity, identity, and particularity, trying to balance this between particularity and some kind of common identity, some kind of core, in other words. And so what I want to, this is more of just a historical matter of where we are in the history of the Anglican tradition from the Reformation. We've had basically three paradigms. So the original paradigm was Erastianism. Do you know what Erastianism is? Erastian. It's a state church. It's where the government and the church are together under the king. Okay? So this is an Erastian model. And that was really the case from the 1500s up until 1800s. You had an Erastian model where the king, the government is in charge of the church. We talked about that with Parliament being in charge of the church. And we talked about when we were reading that piece from John Henry Newman a few weeks ago, in the midst of the Tractarian controversy, the Tractarians are trying to pull the church out from under the government, away from an Erastian model toward an apostolic model. So basically, I missed letters there. Okay. I do this all the time when I type too. For those of you who get text from me, you know. Apostolic. There we go. This is what I want. So the question here is, what is the source of the church's authority? The church's authority, it's uniform. It has one source, the king. The king said so. And it's, again, the king's not writing the doctrine, okay? But why do we have prayer books? Why do we have, worship and include this and don't include that? Well, because the king or parliament has decided this, right? When England moves away from the Erastian model, it's the idea of the apostolic succession. And you see that with the Oxford movement, right? John Henry Newman, Edward Pusey, and John Keble and all these guys, they're trying to get the church out from under the government and root their authority in apostolic succession. Okay? What we have from about the mid-1900s down to the present, and this is also tied into the liturgical reform movement, the Vatican II. By the way, these Vatican I, Vatican II, just because they're Catholic documents doesn't mean they don't have a massive impact on every other denomination. I mean, it's because of Vatican II that we have a revised common lectionary that, for example, the ACNA uses. That 3-year lectionary, maybe you've seen it before. Where'd they get it? Vatican II, right? It affects the Lutherans, it affects the Anglicans, it affects almost everybody in terms of their approach. That's not just the lectionary, but their approach to how they relate to other Christians has effects on how we relate to each other and relate back to them. Yeah. 1960. I want to say it's the 60s. I want to say 62, something like that. No, no, no. So, um, so with that, you get a movement in the mid to late 1900s, which is called the liturgical reform movement, and it's broad. It's beyond a particular denomination. You get the 1979 Book of Common Prayer in the Anglican Church out of the liturgical reform movement. All right, so you have these two, and then so what we're operating here, this center, where's the source of authority? Here, baptism becomes the main point of emphasis. Baptism. Because and there's several implications to this. So if baptism's going to be our thing, it's not the king says so, this is the law of the land, this is when the feast days are, this is when we're going to celebrate, this is how we're going to do it. That's what the law is. And people lots of times went, just to church. That's the law of the land. That's all they ever do, right? You go over here, the bishops trying to connect back with the global church. And you have a kind of tendency towards Rome in some cases with the Oxford movement. And now it's baptism. It's the idea that the baptized believer has been completely initiated into the kingdom of God, that they have a role to play in kind of the decisions that are made, how they partake in the sacraments, all of this. It is more, in other words, you have more egalitarianism, and I know that's a bad word here, but this is not, I don't mean it to be a negative one, okay? You get more lay and egalitarian participation when your basis of authority is that you contribute because we're all baptized believers, okay? So, for example, in the prayer books that come out, okay, if you're going to study more recent modern prayer books, you're going to have more participation in the liturgy from the congregation than the priest doing everything, okay? In our prayer book, or in our services, I should just let you know, we already here have more participation than you usually see in some places. If you've maybe gone to council or something, maybe you've noticed that. But like the Cranmer's prayer, we do not presume to come to this table, but we are the crumbs under the table prayer. That, if you actually look even in this prayer book, the rubric, it says, shall be said by the priest. We say it all together. I like saying it all together. So I've been criticized for us saying it all together. It's all right. It's friendly from within the diocese. But my point is that more recent history, you have more lay participation and more say from lay people in what they want to see. In other words, you've got this tendency toward vernacular. What do the lay people kind of want, right? And you're trying to be more relevant to them. So why? Because you're all baptized people. So there's a couple of implications that come from this. Baptism is seen as the initiation into the faith. So it is not even just a sign, okay? It's not a Presbyterian sign. It is an initiation into the faith. One of the implications here is a stronger doctrine of baptism, okay? Secondly, if you hold to this baptism as initiation into the faith, the next question becomes, in regard to sacraments, why should someone who has been initiated into the faith through baptism not participate in communion? What you get with this is paedo communion. Okay? And this is one of the reasons why it's coming back. And again, like I said, this is not just like a federal vision thing. No, this is part of the new liturgical movement because of these trends that we see, these intra-denominational fights you see sometimes are not just intra-denominational fights. They are part of larger trends within the global church. Okay? And so this renewed emphasis on baptism leads to, with a higher view of baptism, and if you have a higher view of baptism, and this is an initiation into a faith, not just a sign that one day when you grow up and you confess everything correctly, will authorize you to participate in communion, right? What you get is this trend toward paedo communion, saying, why wouldn't you give them communion, right? If they have been initiated into the faith, there's nothing more that they have to do to be seen as a member, a real member in the church. Why wouldn't you give them communion, right? And if we're all baptized, community of believers, this leads to the other one. Shouldn't we all have more say and participation in the liturgy? So these are all implications of this move towards baptism being the foundation of our unity, okay? So I'm an Englishman. That's my source of unity. We live in this realm. We do what the king says. We do what Parliament says. I'm part of the global church. I have bishops. And I'm in unity with anyone else in the global Catholic Church who has been confirmed by bishops. Here, baptism. I'm baptized. You have a proper baptism. I recognize your baptism. You recognize mine. This is our source of unity. Okay, that's the way the trend has gone. So, one other contradiction here. If baptism is all that, okay, if baptism is a complete rite that brings you into the church, the question then becomes, is confirmation necessary? Is confirmation necessary? If you're going to be baptized and participating in communion anyway, why get confirmed? I mean, think about it. Like, why get confirmed? Like, what? So, yeah, and at the same time, confirmation is being made a greater point of emphasis in the recent church. At the same time, when more weight has been put on baptism, which has a greater, it decreases the importance of confirmation in a way. It relativizes it. Tad? Sure. 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 The question becomes the rite of confirmation, though. Are there other ways to do that? So, for example, in early American history, there was no bishop here in the colonies. Our first bishop in America was in 1784, Samuel Seabury. So, with no bishops here in the colonies, does that mean churches didn't grow? They didn't have a bishop has to do confirmation. There was no confirmation. So, how did you join a church? Well, the greater emphasis then was learning the catechism. That's still under the Erastian model. Here's your catechism. When you show you've memorized the answers, then you can join the church. So no, it actually is. This is Erastianism continues down through the 1700s in the colonies, 16 and 1700s in our colonies. So you have the Anglican Church within America growing, but they're not practicing confirmation. There's no bishop here, right? So, and Jamestown was our first colony. So from 1607 to 1784, there's no bishop here. There's no confirmation being practiced here. So how are people joining churches? You study your catechism, and once you can spit back the answers, you know your catechism, then we'll treat you like a member and admit you. But there is no confirmation rite. That's what I'm saying. There's a practice of vetting, but as a rite, as a kind of sacramental rite, there isn't. It's not being practiced here. So once you get over here, it's a really big deal. Confirmation becomes a really big deal because they are reaching back. It's not that they invented it. I mean, confirmation, you can find that going back in early church, but they're looking to recover confirmation. Why? Because your source of authority is your connection to a bishop through apostolic succession. Under baptism, you have the continuing legacy of this era in terms of bringing confirmation back and making it normalized and regular, and that being your right where you're recognized as a full communing member in the church. But what's been undone is the people who are being confirmed here, unlike here, are already communing members. Which brings up the question, I'm already a communing member. Why do I have to get confirmed? Yeah.
So a question, obviously, baptism, we have the biblical roots for that. Confirmation, though, what is it that they're saying is happening in confirmation that it's on some parallel or par with that a bishop has to do it?
So
there's not exception.
There are situations, in fact, I was just reading this week about there are situations where in some prayer books, even today, that allow presbyters to do it. But it's the idea that the two things going on. There is, in confirmation, a grace given, right? So that you receive the initial baptism, the initial washing, but then the grace of growing in faith coming in confirmation. This is a bit of a controversy too, because some will say, don't we just get that in baptism? If we were washed in baptism, do we not also get the grace, to grow in baptism? Why do I need confirmation again? And there is debate about that. That's not even a clear one. So this is where confirmation gets fun. Yeah. So now what I like, as far as the bishop goes, one of the things that the value I see in confirmation is that a bishop has, being the overseer of the church, has had physical contact with everybody that he is in charge of. Now, if the bishop was just a position and he wasn't, in the way the bishop is accountable, just like a presbyter is accountable. Presbyter is accountable for the congregation. A bishop is accountable for all the people in his diocese. And having that physical connection to a bishop, I think symbolically is valuable. But there are questions being raised saying, like, in some places when you don't have bishops coming around, why can't presbyters doing this? And that's basically what you have in the colonies. You don't have the confirmation right. Presbyters examine you, and they weren't saying like, oh, you poor American Christians, you're lesser Christians than the English Christians because you didn't have confirmation. That's why a lot of people are like, why do we even need it? Right? But back then, it was a big deal in terms of becoming a full communing member because children did not participate in communion. So back in the colonies, you have you say, well, a bishop, is it not that important because we can't have a bishop here doing it? No, it's really important because until you're examined by the presbyter, you can't participate in communion.
One of the things in terms of the biblical basis given, I think, in the service itself is Acts 8.
Yes.
Where
Yes.
they had been baptized but not yet received the Holy Spirit, and then the apostles come and
However, yes, it is.
Well,
However, no, I think it's fine.
Formalizing of
Yeah.
something that isn't like
Right.
baptism. Well, anyway.
No, I think it's fine and good, and I don't mind using Acts, but using Acts as the basis is kind of a Johnny come lately in church history. It is a practice seeking a rationale rather than a rationale given prior to a practice.
Are you saying that as a matter of historical fact?
Yes. Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I felt that way about it.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, this is,
And I'm not here trying to raise, a revolt against. I like confirmation, but yeah, honestly, historically, there's no way you can go back and say, oh, that they were totally doing this because this was intent. No, it is a practice seeking a rationale that comes along later, and they go to Acts 8 to do it. But yes,
And
to your point.
That's all I've got. I mean, I'm not against either. I think I do see a practical purpose in it.
Right.
Um,
Which is
not so much for the communion thing, but I think for other things.
so, which is why I think it is foolish to, as the Roman Catholics do, hold the 7 sacraments. Because I would say that you have these 7 things, all are sacramental in a way. There's a sacramental aspect. That's a conversation for another time. I think I've actually talked about it before, but we could talk about it again in the future. What does it mean to be sacramental? It's sacramental, but the idea that it is on par with communion and baptism, given even the inconsistent historical practice of it, the idea that you can make it a sacrament by the church and say Jesus absolutely commanded this, I just think is ludicrous. So yeah, practical, the word you used, is, I think, how I would describe those other 5 minor sacraments. They can be useful. Sometimes people do need to go to a confession, to a priest. And for practical reasons, that would be good. Sometimes it can be useful, the administering with oil, right, for the sick. Last rites, confirmation. I'm trying to remember which one I'm on. It's good. Marriage is good. Ministry, right? But the idea that it's absolutely necessary, commanded by God, all of these other things are practical and good, but should not be at that level. That's precisely one of the differences I would have with Rome on that. Yes. Yes.
And that's why they can take. I don't think it's a bad thing that confirmation, for example, take cultural different significance based on the context. And some of the other ones, I think, would as well. Even marriage, like how the ceremony goes and all these things are cultural.
Well, marriage is another one that, well, I know we spent a lot of time last year talking about marriage, but just I was, reading lately in terms of when marriage starts out, it's not really a church thing or a state thing. It's a family thing. And the church would exist basically to bless the marriage that had already taken place. And then over time, you get more the church taking on a greater role, and it's elevated to a sacrament. And it can only be done in this way, and it has to be a proper priest and all that. But that's, again, I would say a lot of those things are preferred. I think it would be much, much better to have a marriage in a church rather than, going down to the justice of the peace. But to root it back and say, oh, this is the way it kind of always was, and this is what it needs to be a valid marriage, because the church has to do it in this way, and it has to be. I don't think there's any. The history doesn't support that. We should end, because I said that we'd be done at 12:30. We're already 12:45. I just want to show you one thing that because it reminded me of another cultural, or what's considered vernacular. So one of the things you're seeing in a lot of newer Anglican prayer books is the language of the vows change and the reasons for marriage change. So in the marriage ceremony in the Book of Common Prayer in ours, it starts by giving 3 reasons for marriage. First, it was ordained for the procreation of children. It's up front. If that still exists, it's last in a lot of more recent prayer books. Secondly, it was ordained for a remedy against sin and to avoid fornication, that such persons as have not the gift of continency might marry and keep themselves undefiled. members of Christ's body, that is often dropping out. Because it's like, well, that's a holdover from medieval Christianity that did not, where celibacy was celebrated, and so the idea of like, well, if you can't be a celibate, then here's marriage, here's the second best thing, right? Which maybe that's still in there, but the idea that marriage serves this function is kind of dropping out of the language of prayer book services. Thirdly, it was ordained for the mutual society, help, and comfort that one ought to have of the other, both in prosperity and adversity. And this is the one they kind of stick with, is that it's the help for each other, right? And then in the vows, for the vow for the woman, wilt thou have this woman, no, I'm sorry, that's the man. The man shall answer. The second one, wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love him, comfort him, honor him, and keep him in sickness and health, forsaking all others, keep thee only unto him? Now, what's interesting, I'm just looking at this now for the verse. What? No, I'm at a different, just, no. Well, the original, so this one falls in that category too. What I'm critiquing, or at least pointing out, the original prayer books, the several editions up until recently, had the word in there for the wife's vow, obey, and that's come out. So they use honor, I see, but let's see, for the man, nope, there's the same as the man: love, comfort, honor, love, comfort, honor. But it's just interesting, in the older prayer books, the one for the woman had obey. And you could look at that and say, well, that's a cultural thing. We don't really do that anymore. But again, like, how far, I'm precisely the point I keep asking. Like, when do you cross the line between culture and when does your kind of you can see how your theology of marriage could start changing based on, headship and all of those other things with changes in those kinds of words. I think that is still in here. Yeah, because I remember when I did Dave and Helena's wedding. Well, it's not in this one, and this is a new one. I'll have to go.
As long as you remember the date.
When?
I remember it. I don't remember details. I remember that it happened. Date? Okay.
Who cares? All right. Well, we'll close. I'll pray, and then I'll keep looking. I'll keep looking and see if there's a discrepancy between our older prayer books and this new one I just pulled off just ordered. So, our Heavenly Father, thank you for this day of worship that you have given to us. Thank you, Lord, for feeding us with your body and blood, and we thank you for providing for our daily needs. And we ask, Lord, as we travel from here, you would give us safety on the roads, and that you would give us a good, restful remainder to our day, that we might be prepared to serve you in body and soul for the rest of this week. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. That's interesting.